So, on today's episode, we are talking about compliance and, in particular, anti money laundering. 1 in 16 firms say that they have been the victim of money laundering or financial crime in the past 6 months, which is mad. That's quite a huge number. And this means that the weight of anti-money laundering compliance for property firms has never been heavier. So we thought this would be a really good topic for conversation on today's podcast episode. So joining me, I have got Amy and Raj, who are both dialing in. So Amy, would you like to start and introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, my name's Amy Bell and I'm director of Teal Compliance. We're a consultancy that helps law firms with all the rules and the regulations that they need to follow. I personally specialise in anti-money laundering. I've worked in the area for 17 years and I'm the current chair of the Law Society's Money Laundering Task Force, which probably sounds more exciting than it is, but it means that we help the Law Society with policy and guidance and communication on AML. So I'm lucky enough to be in lots of conversations about AML at government level and with the regulators to understand what they really want.
Perfect. So amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today then. I can't wait to hear all of your insights and maybe a little bit of advice. That'd be great. And how about you, Raj?
Yes, hello. I'm Raj Tutt and I'm the director of Resolve Legal. Solicitors and barristers outsource their complaints to Resolve Legal. So we resolve them so that they don't escalate to the Legal Ombudsman, the Bar Standards Board, and the Solicitors Regulation Authority. So we work closely with firms, trying to put mechanisms in place to stop complaints, and then when they do get the complaints, resolving them so they don't escalate.
Amazing. So really, really, really important jobs for property firms to rely on you guys as well. So thank you so much for joining us. So I guess we'll jump straight in. A lot of our topics of conversation on this series of our podcasts are based on, technology. And as tech gets smarter, so do criminals. We all know this, and it becomes quite terrifying, especially if as individuals or as property firms, if you're not that tech savvy. So what is the biggest challenge, would you say, that conveyancers face with anti-money laundering compliance today? Amy, would you like to take that one? And actually, in fact, Amy, could you give us maybe just a brief introduction for any of our listeners that might not be too clued up on what the anti-money laundering compliance area actually is?
Yeah, absolutely. So anti-money laundering is, it does what it says on the tin, I think. It means that we need to have policies, controls and procedures to try and prevent being dragged into money laundering. I mean, the reason that I do what I do is I find it really frustrating that to be working in the legal sector, you've got to put a lot of effort in to train as a solicitor, do your law degree, or however you qualify, or even if you're not qualified, working in a law firm, you take your role really seriously to look after people. And unfortunately, criminals target lawyers. The National Risk Assessment, which is now in its third version, has always identified conveyancing in particular as a high risk activity for money laundering. Now, that isn't to say that necessarily people who are doing conveyancing are money launderers. It is to say that when the criminals want to launder money, they think that moving money through property is a very attractive way to do it, because they can move a big chunk in one transaction rather than lots of little transactions. And so property lawyers come under a huge amount of scrutiny. We unfortunately do bear the brunt, I think, sometimes of frustrations of the government and law enforcement that they worry that our processes are not robust enough to spot these criminals. But the challenge is, as you kind of said, is that the criminals are often quite clever. And so the biggest challenge for us in AML is to really understand how the criminals operate so that we can build our processes to spot them. Unfortunately, with compliance, I mean, all compliance actually, if we're not tuned in to what we're trying to do with compliance, we can end up with a lot of tick boxes, and so we're doing things for the sake of it. We're getting passports and utility bills for the sake of it. We're getting bank statements about source funds for the sake of it. And you've really got to get everybody dialed into why they're getting that information and what they're looking for in it, actually. You've got to understand how the criminals operate and keep up with how they operate. I mean, fortunately, the criminals don't they still do things they've been doing for years. I mean, they do innovate, they absolutely do. But there's some like really long established ways of laundering money that the criminals use that still surprise people. When I point out about the potential to use a nail bar business for money laundering, people are surprised.
Really?
And I'm like, I've been telling this story now for about 20 years. So I don't know why you're surprised, but you know, it's raising the awareness. And I do think that getting everyone to feel that it's relevant to them is one of the biggest challenges that people in law firms have, because it seems like something that doesn't touch you. But once you see that your Common Gardener drug dealer who's dealing in cash, they have to get the money into the banking system. They're not going to use lawyers for that. But once it's there, they need to get it out of their bank. They don't want it in liquid form in the bank that it can be seized. They want it into an asset, and that's where property comes in.
That is so interesting. And I really liked what you said, obviously, about the whole sort of process to training to become a lawyer. You go through all these steps, all these years of training, and actually this side of it isn't something that you would really consider or be very aware of unless you've perhaps come across it before or heard about it before or been trained in this area. And it is really, really scary to be practicing and having this hanging over your head, especially in the conveyancing world. So Amy, would you say there's a common theme with the types of crimes that we're seeing property firms are facing today when it comes to, or certain things that people can look out for that's really common and regular when it comes to?
Yeah, definitely. There are definite red flags of money laundering. There are, and a lot of the regulators, the SRA or the CLC, they do put out red flag warnings, that things that if they were present in a transaction should lead you to be concerned. So things like property that hasn't been owned for very long that's being sold again, or large amounts of cash being put in, or someone selling a property that doesn't seem to go with their lifestyle, or being able to acquire a property, have a lot of funds available to do that. So that there's the kind of really obvious ones. I think that one of the challenges is that the criminals have, by the time they get to the law firms, they've practiced their story on a few people before they come to us. And this is one of the reasons that I try and point out to law enforcement that before a criminal has been to the solicitor, they've probably already spoken to the financial advisor if they're getting a mortgage, if they are putting a big chunk of cash in but still borrowing some money, which they're more likely to do because then it looks like it's a more normal transaction. Or they've seen the agent and the agent says, where's your funds coming from? So they've already practiced their patter a couple of times by the time they get to us. So we need to not just take them at their word. And one of the biggest movements in AML over the past 5-6 years certainly is this focus on, it's not just about getting passports and utility bills, it's about where's the money coming from and why are they doing this transaction in the way that they're doing it. So asking much more kind of searching questions in a way, and I do think lawyers really struggle with it because they don't want the client to turn around and say, are you saying I'm a criminal? And so what happens is the lawyers don't want to ask the questions, and that's where the criminals take advantage of it. They know that the solicitors find that kind of process difficult. And so again, when you're looking at red flags, somebody who gives you all the information you're going to need up front that you haven't asked for, actually on one level looks like this is a brilliant client and they're obviously helping me out here. But the other level is, why would they know that I need all this information?
Yeah, is it very
if you're
well
a
practiced?
Professional, exactly. If you're a professional money launderer, someone's told you what the lawyer's going to ask you for. You're going to have it all packaged up with a ribbon on the top. So, it is equally somebody who's, giving you a hard time about you giving the information. The converse is true as well, which is someone who gives you all the information without you asking for it is a red flag. So, I mean, what's really key for people working in this space is, as I've said, to get away from, and I'm sure nobody listening is in a tick box mentality, or else you wouldn't be tuning into a podcast about your client. You are really interested in doing the right thing. We've just always got to look at your processes and make sure that they're not leaning towards a tick box process. And as I've said before, that people understand the relevance. So why do we get a passport and utility bill? We want to know that we're dealing with the real person, and only the real person should have the passport. Most people should have their own passport or driving license. Why do we want a utility bill? If we need to knock on the door and find them, we need to know which door to knock on. That's why you have to get that information. But having a passport and utility bill doesn't mean that you're insured against the risk of money laundering, because I say this a lot, baddies live somewhere. They've all got passports and driving licenses, and they can all give you a utility bill. If you're thinking somebody can give me this isn't a risk for money laundering, then you are going to be at risk of missing the red flags. Really, the only way to prevent money laundering, to spot well, why they're doing this transaction in this way, and see if it makes sense. I mean, that's the top and bottom of it. Because, you know, a criminal who is laundering money through property might have a patter, and as I've said, that's a bit unfortunate that we're the third in the row that they practice that patter on. But it won't necessarily make any economic sense. Why are you buying this? Why are you selling this house you've just bought? Well, I don't like the neighbours. No one does that. You can settle in for a bit. You know, you've got to really look at it. And when I've looked at cases where there has been money laundering, particularly, you know, in conveyancing cases, the position, the early explanations that you're given by the client seem to stack up. When they think they've got your confidence, that you're confident in them, that it's not money laundering, they think you've taken your eye off the ball. And when money laundering has actually happened, it's often been a change late on. So, for example, a client comes in, I'm going to buy this property and this is how I'm going to fund it. And you go, okay, that's brilliant. It's a, you know, mortgage from the NatWest, brilliant, fantastic. So that's pretty low risk if someone's only putting 5% in or something like that. That's not the MO of a criminal. But if they just before completion say, oh, my mortgage offer fell through, so I'm going to this bridging finance company that's going to bridge me the money till I get a new one, that's super high risk for money laundering, because you don't have to be a regulated business to be a bridging finance company. It's a really great way for a money launderer to launder money, is set themselves up as a bridging finance company, because the money churns really quickly through the transaction. And if we aren't alive to the fact that the CDD we did originally, the thinking we did originally is now different, if we're not alive to thinking about, has something changed? Do I therefore have to go back round my CDD loop? Does this make sense? If we don't do that, that's when money laundering happens.
Yeah.
Very rarely is it because you spot something at the beginning. Now, I am talking about career criminals there. There's also, of course, the risk from people who've just been doing a bit of tax evasion, you know, self-employed people not declaring things properly. That kind of stuff you probably would spot much earlier on when you're looking at their own finances, and you see bits of cash payments and things like that. But the career criminals, the ones that are doing it frequently, they are going to have a decent patter, but probably lack a sensible reason for what they're doing, because there isn't one. The real reason is they're just trying to launder the money. But they're not going to tell you that.
Exactly. It's a tough one, isn't it? Because you said there's that real fine line for solicitors between if you've got that gut feeling that, hang on a minute, something isn't quite right here, but then not wanting to ask questions that the criminal's probably used to being asked, so they've already got a rehearsed sort of script for it. So it's then trying to dig a little bit deeper, but they're not wanting to feel like it's an interrogation in case someone is really genuine. It's hard.
It's an interesting one, because I think, you know, when you think about compliance, you've always got to put the lens of human behavior. That's why it fascinates me so much, compliance, because the aim of the game when you work in compliance is getting people to do what you want them to do. I mean, it's no more complicated than that. We've got to protect you. We're going to ask you to do things, and we're going to have to convince you to do them. That's what compliance people do. And what's interesting is when you think about the behavior of a criminal, if you do have a really robust source of funds, source of wealth process that you deploy to everybody, a criminal will run a mile when you start really digging. They'll be like, oh, I can't give you that information, I haven't got it. And you'll go, well, I can't act. And that'll be the end of that, you know, and you'll be scratching your head going, were they a criminal or not? You know, you might not actually land on the fact that they are a criminal, but if that's the whole point of anti-money laundering compliance. The whole point of it is it scares the baddies
them off. Exactly. I also love how you call them baddies.
Yeah, I do. It's a bit of a catchphrase of mine, but it scares them off, because they're like, oh, I'm going to go down the road to someone who's not going to ask me all these questions. And actually, what's really interesting in my career is that is the fear that is described to me when I say, why don't you ask the questions? They're like, well, I'm scared they're going to go down the road. I'm like, well, if they're a baddie, that's fine. That's what you want them to go down the road. But and the other half of that equation is you need to be able to explain to the clients in a way that doesn't offend them that you're asking them these questions. And that's where I kind of alluded to at the very beginning, which is you've got to tune into what it's for. Such a lot of people, like you said, Vicky, they don't get the training. It seemed very remote to them. It seems like something that happens in certain parts of town and it's nothing to do with where they live. And they don't necessarily understand the damage that it caused. They reckon, now estimates vary between 31 billion and over 100 billion pounds globally of money laundered. Now that is a bucket load of money and could end poverty tomorrow, right? If this money wasn't crazy with criminals. Okay, there are 39,000 people suspected of being in serious and organised crime. They're proper baddies in the UK, 39,000 of them. And when we need to understand the scale of it, if every one of those baddies was given a bit of money by the gang and sent out to go and buy a property, that'd be 3.9% of all conveyancing transactions.
Wow.
But we don't think that. We think we never see them. And this is what we've got to start tuning into. We've got to start realizing how common it is and really start thinking about how they operate. And the other thing that I say very, very often to people when I'm trying to help them with this is you need to give your lawyers a script. They need to have something to say that explains to the client, I know you're not a baddie, but this is designed so that we don't let baddies in, that we care about this stuff because, there's money taken out of the economy. I just posted this morning about a lady here in Manchester who's just been sent to prison, and the judge said, yes, you supply cannabis, and yes, you might think that that's not a bad thing, but it does affect people's long-term mental health. It affects their family relationships, and so people trivialize it, and actually it isn't trivial. These things lead on to harder drugs. They lead on, and the thing about the criminals is, why are they doing it? Why are they doing this? They're just doing it so they can afford a bigger car than the next baddie, a bigger house than the next baddie, a shelf full of Rolexes so they don't have to wear the same one every day. They don't care about the people. They just care about money and power. And real people suffer about that. Any families that have been caught up with their teenage children in county lines drug dealing, they are vulnerable children that are targeted in all areas of the country. There's no kind of bit of the country that escapes county lines drug dealing, and they recruit children into it. When you start plugging into that and you start opening your eyes to that, it suddenly becomes important.
Yeah.
And when we speak to clients about that, they get it then. When we say, the government says we've got to ask you for all this stuff, I'm really sorry, clients are like, well, I'm not a baddie, so why are you asking me?
Yeah.
When you say, we care about our communities and our families and people in the local area, and we're going to play our bit in making sure that the criminals can't use our firm to do that. So I know it's irritating, but can I ask you these questions? You're going to get much better buy-in from the client. You're going to get much more understanding from the client. Your lawyers are not going to be scared of asking the question. So it's just really reprogramming how we talk about AML. It's not just a bit of irritating admin. It's unfortunately a necessary activity that we have to do to try and shut the door to what is quite a sizable population of baddies, really, 39,000.
I mean, this is opening my eyes to it. And I never kind of thought about it in this way as well, and kind of the knock-on effects, and actually it's part of this massive, bigger, really serious picture.
Well, imagine that I know a lady down the road here in Manchester. She runs a cafe, and she started this cafe years ago, and she wanted to employ local people in the area, give them that, if they weren't able to get experience, let them get real work experience with her, and then help them take their catering qualifications, hygiene qualifications, so they could go on and get a career. For her, it was a real community enterprise, okay, but she's located in a place that's full of takeaways that may or may not be muddying up their takings with drug money, and people are going to these other businesses that are funded by criminals. This is the same with nail bars.
Yeah.
Someone who's gone off to college and they've got all the beauty qualifications and they're absolutely excited about setting up, can't compete with the people who are human trafficked into nail bars that are working for £2 an hour. you can't compete with them. So what I always think is there's different messages that get through to different people. Parents will really feel the message that I say about their children being targeted for counterline drug dealing or money muling through students' accounts. People who are business people who've got ambitions will really understand what I'm saying about how much money it takes out your local economy that is just going into the pocket of criminals, and I think we have to have all these messages. We have to have a much different conversation about it.
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of then the conveyancing firms that are doing what they're doing to put all the right protection in place. So you mentioned like having the script and, the language and the education of solicitors and clients as well. In terms of what the best conveyancing firms are doing to put that right protection in place, what would you say that is? And also from like a cyber security perspective as well, because we've touched on obviously the human element and what we can do as people. But
there's absolutely, cyber, it's same but different, because there's the reasons that a property business would be targeted for cybercrime is because they've got loads of money in the bank or they're moving loads of money. So it's almost a different end of the criminal spectrum. Money laundering is what they do after they've stolen money. The cybercrime is what they do to steal money. That's basically it. In terms of system, first of all, policies and procedures that people understand and they're able to do. I talk a lot about a concept of compliance that works on the basis that a lot of people tell me that they don't think their compliance is working and they don't know why. And that has a few kind of parts to it. The first one is you've got to be super clear on what your problem you're trying to tackle. And as I say, that's about the language, that's being about really clear about what the problem is in the first place and getting help if necessary on how to do it. One challenge that a lot of conveyancing firms have is they're not necessarily of the size that have in-house experts on this kind of stuff. So it's tapping into the right support from the law society, a local law society. Obviously, that's what we do. But, there's loads of places out there to get support to find out what you're supposed to be doing, getting clarity on that, resourcing it properly. As I say, not everybody can have an AML expert in. They all need to have a reporting officer. They probably all will want to have a compliance officer for money laundering, but making sure that if you are doing client due diligence searches, you've got the right provider, you've got the right process. There's massive advances been made in that, especially since COVID, with using the technology to speed up the process of getting the right and more robust checks actually than looking at passports and utility bills. The electronic check where they check whether a passport's genuine is much more robust than eyeballing one. After you've got the resourcing of it properly, the capacity to, you really need to think about how you communicate it. That's these messages we've been talking about, but also in what you're asking people to do. I'm sure we've all had death by policy in the past, where you've had a policy to read and it's hundreds of pages long and you're like, what is it you want me to do? I always say there should just be a key facts document on the front that tells people exactly what they should be doing. And if they do have to wade through it, I said this, I was talking to someone yesterday, sometimes you do have to have a 50-page AML policy because there's so many things you've got to explain that you've thought about, but your lawyers don't need to read that. They just need to read the bit they need. Don't make them plow through it all. And the training that you give them, the legislation, the fundamental legislation of how money laundering works has been the same for 19 years. So if you just keep sending them on a training course every year that repeats that to them, no wonder they've checked out. Because they've been hearing it for years. The training's got to be relevant. It's got to be relevant to what they're doing. It's got to be practical about what they're dealing with. Then commitment is the fourth bit of compliance that works, which is ask people, do you understand what I'm asking you to do? And are you going to promise to do it? Now, this applies for any compliance, not just AML. Unless you explain properly what they're expected to do, you get something that my husband likes to call plausible deniability. Like, well, you didn't actually say you wanted me to do it. Am I not good enough? And this is why we will see in a lot of situations of non-compliance within a law firm that there's some plausible deniability about it. I couldn't do it because. But one thing you don't get in lawyers is if you ask a lawyer to promise to do something, then they will do it. Because it has to be our word is our bond. And so nobody ever does that though. Nobody ever comes at the end of a training session saying, do you understand after this training session what I asked you to do? Yes, I do. Do you promise you're going to do it? Yes, I do. Then you will get much better compliance just with that one step.
Yeah.
And because it lives in a different compartment in people's heads.
And
it's like they're much more aware because you've been very practical and very specific about what you're expecting.
that was it.
And then you have to be consistent. So you have to check if they're doing it. There's nothing worse than rolling a policy and procedure out and then never knowing if it's working. It's not helping you. Compliance is about having confidence that you have a framework that protects people from whatever the thing is that you're trying to do, AML, a regulator, the police, whatever it is. You've got to check it's working. Because if you don't check it's working, it's like your children, right? You teach them how to brush your teeth and you stand over them for ages and weeks and weeks and weeks, and then you think they're going to do it, and then you find out they're not done it for 3 weeks because you think they were, you know. If you don't keep checking until it's like it is business as usual, then it's going to fall away. And then the last one, and this is the biggest bit actually, it's culture. The biggest reason that compliance programs fail is a cultural issue within the business. It's not for a lack of a policy. I mean, we can improve the policies, as I've said, by making sure that they're clear and concise. But if you don't have a business that supports culture, the culture of compliance, it will fall down. You can do all the other steps and you still will not have compliance that works. And that's about making sure that a few things, actually, we have really honest conversations with people, especially when they're not doing what we've asked them to do. This is why the commitment bit of it is so important, because you're asking people to do it. The important thing is you've got to follow through if they don't. Yeah. And as an industry, that's what we find really difficult to do, is hold people to account when they're not doing what they said they were going to do. Yeah. And that's a universal problem, I think, in the legal sector, in professional services sector, and actually comes from the model that we have traditionally of managing our businesses, which is partnerships, and people are very reluctant to rock a partnership boat by challenging people, because it's often quite influential, well-known, well-seen people within the business that, you know, equity partners, and nobody wants to kick off a big fight about you didn't do this though. But we need to be brave about that stuff, because compliance is so important, not just AML compliance, all compliance. Compliance is there to protect people. And so we need to start helping people to have those conversations. One of the most common things that I recommend to a firm that they look into, it's not something we do, but I recommend that they look at dealing with difficult conversation training to help people, challenge people, to help people address issues, and really make it clear that they will deal with it, because there's nothing worse for all the other people who are trying to do the right thing to see someone get away with not doing it. That, well, why should I then? And that's when your compliance program comes crumbling, crashing to the ground. So, you know, it's about really thinking about building a compliance program that's going to work with all those elements in. The specifics of, you know, the CDD and having a consistent policy for AML, for source of funds, source of wealth and things like that, they're all really important. But like I say, a policy on its own, a process on its own, is not going to protect you, because, as I say, there's a lot of elements in it.
Exactly. That's it. I met so many amazing takeaway points there. I really liked what you said about the whole culture of compliance as well, because I used to work for I've worked for a couple of large companies before, and I had two very different experiences where the culture of compliance in one company, it was like, oh, compliance, oh, another policy, oh, nothing was implemented. There weren't any consequences if people weren't in line with the policies and what have you. But then another company where compliance was more like compliance was a little bit cooler. Do you know what I mean? It had more of that, where people really respected it, and it was really ingrained in everything people did, and people were encouraged to be compliant, and you'd sort of, I don't know, look out for one another. And
that message comes from the top, right?
100%.
And it comes from the top. And this is the way over my career. I started off in compliance accidentally. I was a personal injury lawyer, and they needed someone to be a trainer, a compliance trainer, and they also, at the same time, they needed someone to look at their AML compliance. So that's how I ended up doing it.
And you never looked back.
And it was just completely accidentally. And I'd come from a firm, I trained in a firm that had a really poor culture. Everyone was scared. There was probably a good amount of bullying going on. That's a whole other it's a whole other podcast that telling you about
yeah, 100%.
about my early career. But then I went to this other firm where they invested in compliance. They wanted people properly trained, properly understanding what's going on, because they identified that great client service requires compliance. In fact, compliance is just about delivering great client service. That's the whole point of it. And at the end of the day, as a solicitor, as I am, as all of my colleagues are, you know, that I deal with in law firms, we don't get up in the morning to get something wrong for a client. We get up in the morning to help a person solve their problems, you know. And the very worst thing for us actually is to make it worse.
Yeah.
So, you know, we don't do these things on purpose. We do them because there's a whole load of other competing objectives. And this is another cultural point. If the cultural message the business has is get your billing done at all costs, then compliance slips.
Goes out the window. Because
you've got to, you know, or people have got more work than they can actually properly manage because of capacity issues, compliance slips. And when compliance slips, then that's where client service goes, and that's where you get complaints, which is not what I'm here to talk about today.
Well, that leads us on perfectly then, Amy. Thank you so many amazing points that I hope listeners, and especially those that are, you know, senior leaders in firms, there are so many amazing points, even if it was just like you say, like fine tuning certain elements, the language, getting that script in, or just checking in on your staff, just, you know, say, do you feel comfortable with these sort of conversations? Do you know why it is that we're looking out for what it is we're looking out for? So amazing. Thank you so much. On then the whole client service and complaints side, Raj, would you like to give us a little bit of an overview? So obviously solicitors rely on Resolve Legal if they are receiving complaints, and you said that conveyancers, did you say that they receive... Is it one of the groups that receive a lot of complaints? If you could just remind us before.
Yeah, so the Legal Ombudsman, they very helpfully publish data on their website which shows what types of complaints they get, which areas of law, what the heads of complaints are, and that kind of information is available on there. And it shows that conveyancing accounts for 30% of the complaints that they receive.
30%?
And that might not sound like a lot because it's a third. But if you look at the next most complained about area is family law, which has 14%.
Oh, wow, okay.
So it's more than double family law. And PI and wills and probate, they've all got about 13%, 12%. So that 30% of conveyancing is actually a lot. It makes up a really big proportion of the complaints that they receive.
So why do you think that is?
Well, the most complained about head of law is poor communication. And we see it time and time again. I've just bought a house recently, and I know that I wanted to know like 3 times a day what's happening, because it's your house. It's usually your dream house. You can't wait to get in there, and you want it to happen as quickly as possible. And it seems like nothing's happening on the other end. So it's always about poor communication or delay. What we do, going back to what Amy was saying before about being sensitive when you ask baddies or clients questions to satisfy your money laundering checks about not offending people, they actually do complain. So we've had some of those types of complaints where people have come forward and said it's discrimination, or, you know, it's because I'm this ethnicity, it's because I'm buying in this area, it's because I'm selling a house in this area, and you've asked me all these questions, otherwise you wouldn't have. You know, just to defer from the fact that they've been asked these questions that they don't want to answer. Yeah. So we do actually see a lot of those complaints. People will just complain about anything, really.
Yeah.
They're just a lot more savvy these days, and a lot of them know that if you complain to your solicitor and it goes to the legal ombudsman, the solicitor will get fined £400. So they actually just say, you might as well pay me £400 to stop this going to the ombudsman, and then I won't go. So that, like, blatant about it.
Oh, so my goodness. I didn't know that. So if the complaint goes to the legal ombudsman, there's a £400 fine on that solicitor.
Yes, but they do have discretion to waive it. So if you've taken all steps internally to resolve the complaint satisfactorily, then they won't charge the case fee. Or if the complaint's not upheld, it won't be charged. But if, in most cases, if the complaint's upheld and you didn't take steps internally to deal with it, you get charged the £400 case fee. And the complaint gets published on the Legal Ombudsman website against the firm's name. And clients know that. So they will actually just come out and say, you might as well pay me to save this going on the Amazon website and to save you having to pay £400.
Oh, wow.
And it's a lot of those where it's, like Amy called them, baddies, where I didn't want to give all of my ID checks. This should have been satisfactory. You don't trust me. You don't believe me. It's because of this. And often when you've given all that ID and the firm's not satisfied, so they refuse instructions, they then want that paperwork back. And under data protection, you're not giving it me back. And it's my information. It's my property. It's mine. You must give it back to me. But firms have to obviously retain it and they're not giving it back. That's another really common complaint that we're seeing again and again.
It becomes really messy, doesn't it? And I think it is obviously on the client side. I just bought a house just before Christmas as well. When you're buying and selling, you're driven by emotion, aren't you? And especially nowadays as well. We actually just did a podcast episode and we were talking about the relationship between estate agents and conveyancers, and they were saying that the one sort of bugbear between that relationship, it's communication again, and just making sure that everyone's kept in the loop so that the client is then kept in the loop and knows what's going on. Do you find on the communication front, if a client is complaining about communication, do they have unreasonable standards, or is it that they're quite reasonable and it's just a case of because of the way that the market is in terms of housing and the house moving processes and all the challenges that conveyancers face at the moment, is it a case that they just can't keep up and sort of meet the client's expectations?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of both. So there are some people that are unreasonable, some people who want 2 or 3 updates a day, who will constantly keep calling until they get called back. But likewise, there are some that are reasonable and waiting to hear back and not getting it. The problem is, I think with conveyancers, they rely a lot on third parties. So a lot of people complain that there's delay in registering their purchase once they've bought it. But again, that's not due to the firm, that's down to the land registry. They'll complain during the course of the transaction that nothing's happening quickly enough, but sometimes you're waiting for searches to come back, you're waiting for the other side to reply to inquiries, but you're waiting on other people, so there's nothing really you could be doing. But because the client's not hearing back from you, they just think that you're delaying and you're not doing anything. That's where the communication comes in. I think that firms at the very outset should say, look, this is what the process is, this is how long it's likely to take, this is why it's not in our hands. If you don't hear from us because of this, and I just think they could be more transparent at the beginning to manage expectations, so the clients know what to expect. People have got their old-fashioned ways. I know that my dad was just purchasing a property recently, and he's in his 70s, and thought, in the olden days, it used to happen like this. This is good for you. We'll be in 3 weeks. We'll be in by my birthday, and we're doing this. But I'm like, no, Dad, it doesn't work like that because there's so many different steps. And he's like, oh no, the solicitor's my friend. He'll do it really fast. No, he won't, because it's not in his control.
Yeah.
A lot of the parties, lenders and everything else that contributes to it. So I think that people need to be better informed when they first instruct a firm to understand the process. That would really eliminate a lot of the complaints.
Definitely. And I think that's the thing as well, isn't it? As if you're buying or selling a property, and I was a first time home buyer, I had no idea about the process. Number one, the length of time it was going to take, the different sort of parties that were involved. Like it wasn't just my estate agent and my solicitor. You're relying on X, you've got to wait for searches, you've got to wait for this to come back. And if you don't know that, it's really easy, especially again, if you're itching to get into your new home, to be like, you're not doing your job, or you should be doing this. And exactly like you say, unless the client is made aware of that in a really nice way, then they're likely to be more empathetic and compassionate, compassionate in that situation. So that communication and transparency, an amazing tip. How else what other advice would you offer to firms to kind of reduce the amount of complaints when it comes to communication?
Well, it is really that managing expectations, and we saw it a lot with the stamp duty holiday, because everybody then wanted to complete by the 30th of June.
Yeah.
And if you didn't, it didn't mean you were just going to be in your house one day later than otherwise. It meant that you put potentially thousands of pounds out of pocket for some people. So at that time, there was such a huge pressure on conveyancers. And I remember keep saying to all my clients then, you must emphasise at the beginning of the retainer and throughout that we can't guarantee you will complete by the 30th of June. And you just have to keep giving that message again and again and again. Even if you think you're repeating yourself, put it on the bottom of every email, say it in every call. just keep repeating it. So it's really about managing expectations.
Yeah.
So it goes back to the communication, so the client's aware of what's going on, and just being more transparent, because if they're calling you not hearing back, they're just presuming that you're not doing anything on their file. And that's when it gets worse.
Yeah, like they're just sat having a coffee and chilling. And it takes it back to what Amy was saying as well about sort of training people that work in firms how to have those difficult conversations, so that you get comfortable with it and you feel more confident and you can deliver it, that conversation as best as possible. And then the other common complaint that you said received, what was that?
That was delay. But we spoke about that as well. That was all really down to third parties, because you're waiting for searches, you're waiting for inquiries to come back. So mainly with conveyancing, it is about poor communication and delay. There's a few about failure to advise, so not knowing about the process again and what to expect. And then we have some where things have gone really wrong. You know, when you come to sell the property years and years on, you can come to learn it wasn't registered in your name, or you thought you bought the house in the adjoining garage, but actually you didn't buy the garage, it was just the house. And those types of issues come up, not at the time of purchase, but when you go on to sell the property and you have difficulty then in selling it. There's quite a few of those, which ties in with negligence. So yeah. Lots of different things.
That's it. And I think it is so tough, that part and parcel of becoming a solicitor. You know, to Amy's point on the compliance side of things, the AML side of things, there is, it can, especially if you've just qualified, it can feel quite scary. And I think if I were a solicitor, I think if I were to receive a complaint, and because of what the clients can do, posting it online and it goes against the firm, I'd feel so responsible. And I think I guess you can feel quite anxious about that whole side of things. If solicitors do receive complaints, or if anything like this happens, maybe if a client's been unfair or something, are you sort of able to advise on how to like deal with that from an emotional point of view as well?
And usually clients just want to be heard. So there are those ones who want the money and they want revenge, but sometimes they just want to be heard. So really it just needs an empathetic ear, listening to them on the phone and saying, yes, I understand that you must have felt like that. I understand you must be disappointed about that. Yes, that wasn't the best, but usually a telephone conversation can resolve it if you just explain that, look, this wasn't because of what the firm did. It wasn't because of X, Y, Z. Actually, it was because of this. They raised inquiries of the seller 10 days ago, but they didn't respond, and just explaining it. So usually you can resolve a lot of complaints just over the telephone by explaining to the client so they understand what went wrong, and that it wasn't always the firm's fault. And I give that advice back to firms all the time, because if they just kind of like get the checkbooks out, what do I need to pay to make this go away? What do I need to pay? And you don't always have to pay. Sometimes apology is enough, just listening is enough, and just speaking to them is enough. So I think firms can be better advised and not to be afraid of complaints, because you can always fix them.
Yeah, exactly. And like you say, just because it is published online as well, just firms being aware of these are the common complaints that come in, and these are what clients would be likely, because they just want to be seen, to jump on just to get some attention, and how to sort of avoid that. Really interesting.
Firms should just always remember that it doesn't matter how perfect your service is, people are going to complain. So not to take it personally, not to worry about it, not to let it put you off, you know, a career in law, because they are going to complain.
Exactly.
So it's not really something to worry about. You can't avoid it, but if anything, you can learn from it, because it's an opportunity to put things right. So you learn from what other people have said, and you just try to fix it and make sure you don't do it next time. So
yeah, 100%. And I think on like a personal basis, if you did ever receive a complaint, it's like when they say when an author writes a book and they'll have all these 5-star reviews online, and then the one bad review or the one complaint about something we can then focus on. So just learn from it and focus on all the good.
I did also see it reported that if a client complains about a firm and the complaint's handled really, really well, they're more likely to re-instruct that firm than another firm, because they know that if something goes wrong, it will be dealt with really well.
That is a great point.
So I've always remembered that since I heard it, and it's actually happened because I've worked with firms that have had these clients come back again and again and again, just because they know they've got that kind of protection. If everything's not absolutely perfect, they're going to look at it at the end and they're going to sort it out. That's dealing with a complaint really well does actually work in your favour sometimes, because it means that the person comes back because they trust that any issues will be dealt with.
That's it. And that is that trust factor. It's kind of like they've passed the test. Oh, we've got that trust now. And amazing. I'd just like to end this as well, just asking if you wouldn't mind, because both of you have so much experience. I'd love to ask each of you, what's the best professional advice that anyone has given you? So this isn't necessarily on the complaints and compliance sort of context, but just in general, throughout your career, what is the best professional advice that anyone's given you? Raj?
I think mine probably would be to believe in yourself. When I set up Resolve, so still quite young, I was going from a full-time job where you had a regular income to setting up the business, and I think there were more people saying don't do it than were saying do it. The ones that stuck out are the people that said believe in yourself, you can do it. And that stuck with you when people that you know say, oh, you can definitely do it, believe in yourself, you've got what it takes, you'll be able to do it.
Absolutely love that. And Amy, how about you? What's the best professional advice you've ever been given?
So I had two, really. The first one when I was a lawyer was don't worry, we're insured, was the best one.
I love that.
You're scared about these things. That's what professional indemnity insurance is for. You know, we take it for granted that you're going to try and do your best. Sometimes, as Raj says, it doesn't always go that way for whatever reason. It's not career-ending stuff. Just you've got to tell someone and ask for help straight away. And that came off the back of them saying, listen, we know you're going to make mistakes. That's what we have insurance for. Was the first one from being a solicitor. And that's one I passed on to solicitors as possible. You know,
I love it.
We do know that things are going to go wrong, because they do, because we're all just humans and none of us are perfect. And yeah, so that's the one I would pass on to solicitors particularly. In terms of business advice, so I had somebody say to me, what would you do if you could give your time and talent freely? Go and find a job doing that. And that I think it was a real turning point in me changing to become self-employed and really focus on what I do. But there is that old adage, isn't there? If you do what you love, you never work a day in your life. And I'm not going to pretend that this isn't work. It is work.
Yeah.
But I do think, and I do say that to a lot of people, I'm like, is this really the thing that gets you up in the morning? Because if it isn't, we're not here for a very long time, and quite a lot of it you're going to spend working. So, you know, do try and seek out the things that you would do if you could give your time and talent freely, and you know what you're here for, really. So yeah, and that's something that I do with all of my team. And like, you know, on Team Teal, is it have we built a job for you that is that you want to get up in the morning and come and do it? If not, that's fine. You know, and if you want something else than being on Team Teal because of that, I'd rather you did that. You know, we're trying to build a team where they're excited to get up and come to work every day.
I absolutely love that, and it goes back again with Raj's journey as well. Is it like your zone of genius, isn't it? That they talk about, you find something that you are really, really good at and that you really, really love, and then you translate that into a way where you can serve others and where there's that gap, and then you've formed obviously these amazing businesses as a result of that. So absolutely amazing. Thank you both so much. This has been great. Was there anything else that you'd like to add at the end?
I think I would just say anti-money laundering, there is this pressure on lawyers. I think lawyers do have to be able to demonstrate that they are trying to get it right. There is increased focus from the regulator. That's because there's increased focus on the regulator to be able to say what they're doing. And you know, if all of the things you've got to do, and I would say this, wouldn't I? Don't push AML to the back of the list. Years gone by, nobody would really knock on your door and ask you about it. These days, they will come and ask you about it. So if there's any part of your compliance program that you want to make sure you're on top of, AML is it in terms of regulatory risk.
Yeah, put it on the top of the priority list, listeners. A lot of our topics of conversation, again, are always around this communication. It really is the key, isn't it? So thank you both so much.